Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. We're back for number 2 in a series of 3 covering building distributed applications with HarperDB on Ametnes Cloud. So pretty exciting, but let's go ahead and cover, I guess, some of the introductions, I guess. So my name's Michael King, and I'll be your host today, taking you along with me as we uncover kind of the custom functions feature inside of HarperDB. But you're not just stuck with me today. I've got Jackson from HarperDB and then Michael from Ametnes joining me again today. Jackson, for anybody who missed the last webinar, could you give us a quick introduction of yourself?
Sure. Jackson Rep, Field CTO for HarperDB.
Real quick.
So quick.
Gotta love it. And then Michael, how about you?
So yeah, Michael Sekumanya, CEO of Ametnes. Been doing this for quite some time, so happy to be here.
Awesome. Quick and easy. You gotta love it. So I guess kind of as for myself, I guess I don't know, I don't have quite as quick of a title. I guess developer advocate, and that would be kind of quick, right? But a little bit about me. So I've been a full stack engineer for 10 years and recently made the transition over to developer relations, I guess, because I don't know, I've always considered myself a less introverted developer, I guess you could say. So anyways, we can go ahead and get into some of the speakers. So here's all of our beautiful pictures and our titles. Then we can get into some of the topics for today that we're going to be focusing on. So we've already got the speaker introductions out of the way. So the first thing that we'll be starting off with is a quick introduction of Ametnes and HarperDB, just kind of getting some background information on it and kind of what some of the hints into what we'll be covering today. Then what I'm going to do is actually provision a Ametnes instance using the Terraform provider that was just released for Ametnes Cloud. So pretty excited to kind of play with that a bit more. Last time we used the web interface, which is just as good, but I don't know, I always prefer to kind of do things as infrastructure as code. It's very repeatable and I enjoy it. So then from there, we're going to cover custom functions kind of in detail and some of the neat stuff that's possible with it. Then I'm going to cover debugging the custom functions because, we're never going to do things right on the first try. And then what's really interesting is we're going to get into everybody's favorite, which is unit testing the custom functions. And I know that's sometimes a pain point for some people, but it's always a necessary evil in software development, of course. And then I'm going to show you actually how you can deploy these custom functions projects to different instances and use, for example, a CI/CD pipeline to deploy a custom functions project to a remote instance. Then finally, we'll wrap all of the custom functions detail up with looking at some of the project templates that are available. And then we'll end everything off with some of the Q&A. So be sure to get your questions in during the presentation. If we see any of the questions pop up, we'll try to answer them kind of as we're going along in the presentation. So ask away. So before we get into the introduction, we are going to be recording this webinar, so you can always come back later and catch the rest of it if you do miss any of it, or if you got in late, you can always catch up to what you missed. And then, as I mentioned, we are doing Q&A during the presentation, so make sure you ask any questions that you have. So the first thing I'd like to do is I'd like to turn the hot seat over to Jackson and let him give us a bit of an introduction into HarperDB and a little bit of information about custom functions.
Thanks, Michael. Let me share my screen here.
Sure, let me stop sharing.
All right. So as we discussed last time, and this is not a whole overview of HarperDB, it's a little boiled down, but in the previous episode, I told you all about what we do. But we are a globally distributed application platform. That means despite the name HarperDB, we do way more than just be a database. We are, in fact, a database with an application tier and a distribution mechanism. And the application tier is what we'll be working with today. And that feature is called custom functions. Distribution just refers to our ability to move data between multiple nodes of HarperDB in a distributed system. So if we look at custom functions, they are a file-based, custom user-defined functionality, right? This could be a file that sets up an endpoint for an API. So you can set up your own API endpoints, and I'm pretty sure Michael's going to do that. They can also be endpoints that maybe start, stop, or get the status of other long-running processes that are acting to, say, collect sensor data from a sensor that's maybe attached to the host system. And then ultimately, it's also a layer of API that's directly on top of the data. So there's not an extra hop from an API server over to your database. So it's extremely fast and lowers latency dramatically. So this is a terribly drawn schematic by yours truly that defines sort of how HarperDB Studio, our management tool, can view any given route and the code defined therein. And in reality, in HarperDB, the software, there's an API, a custom function folder. And in that folder lay the files where you define your endpoints. Now, in order to make this fit with a lot of developer workflows, we didn't want to build something that was proprietary and had to be wholly managed by us. And Michael will walk you through that process. But really, we wanted to work the way developers work. So locally here on the left-hand side, you can see that we might have friends.js, which is a service that gets my friends from the database. It's an API endpoint. And inside that functions folder, we'll have a template or the friends endpoint, add friend, servers, any of the endpoints I might have can be broken out into their own files, and those will have their own routes. And then because they are local files, you can use GitHub. You can commit these projects. In fact, we have a GitHub repo called HarperDB add-ons, where we've actually saved a whole bunch of these project templates with everything from machine learning, classification, and recommendation to a simple REST API that allows you to use the REST standard to get data into and out of HarperDB. And then finally, there's a deploy mechanism, and you can deploy from within the studio the ability to basically say, okay, this project I've been working on locally, I would like to package it up and deploy it to all of the other servers in my cluster. Now, we don't require that you obviously log into Studio to deploy that. We can also set up a GitHub action, and I think Michael will show you that, a GitHub action that effectively deploys functions to remote servers when you simply commit and approve a PR and merge to main. So the custom function is just like declaring a route on say, well, if you're familiar with Express, a lot like that. If you're familiar with Fastify, it's exactly like that because it's powered by, in fact, Fastify. So in essence, you're allowed to add a hook for pre-validation, and you can have that be a validate user function that calls out to a third-party API like a Auth0 or an Okta, and then you can approve that, and then you get down to the handler where it returns the actual payload for the data query or inserts the data that the user is trying to insert. So it's very, very easy to ultimately interact with these custom functions in whatever way you want to. And with that, I will turn over, and you can see some of the client calls for the handler. So with that, I will turn it back over to Michael to tell us a little more about Ametnes.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, Michael, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to you for you to give us a bit of an introduction into Ametnes Cloud for anybody who may have missed the last webinar or it's new to them.
Yep, sure. Let me know if you can see my screen.
Yeah, looks good.
Yeah, good. So what is Ametnes? Well, so Ametnes really helps automate the provisioning and management of cloud-native data services. So we run on Kubernetes, meaning that we are able to provision data services across public or private cloud environments. It could be in your private data center as well. So essentially, Ametnes offers a wide range of data services. This includes SQL databases, NoSql databases, messaging services such as MQTT brokers, Kafka, or workflow automation tools such as Airflow. Now, running in Kubernetes makes us cloud agnostic, and so we are able to provision data services on any public or private cloud environment. So obviously with Ametnes, you get a full managed service while running in your private cloud environment. This includes automated upgrades, managed backups, automated certificate management, as well as professional support for any data service that we help you provision. So, and obviously with that comes so what we intend to do is to work with the data service vendors such as HarperDB to get a better understanding of the product. As we have done for the last 6 months. So we build those relationships. We play around with the products, make sure we stress test them, work with them, identify any defects that might be needed. And in that, in doing so, that relationship gives us a bit of the ability to understand these services quite deeply and intimately. And so we're able to offer the customer a very good service on that front. So what you see here is a list of data services that we currently support, as well as those that are in the pipeline. But we are open to suggestions on which data service to support. So please visit our website and send us an email if you have any suggestions. For more information, you can visit us on our website or send us an email or visit our YouTube channel to watch the demo videos. That's it. Thank you. Over to you, Michael.
Awesome. Yeah, that's cool to see. I did a project recently with HarperDB and Kafka. So that's cool to see that y'all have that come in as well, because that'd be interesting to kind of work with them both together. So, all right. So now that we have some of the introductions out of the way and everybody's up to speed, I'd like to go ahead and shoot over to the demo. So the first thing I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again real quick. This looks good. And what I've prepared is in the Ametnes organization on GitHub is we have a repository set up for this webinar called HarperDB Webinar 1. And this is where you'll be able to find all of the code for today's webinar. And the first part we're going to be looking at is actually deploying via Terraform. And what we have in here are all of the Terraform files we'll actually need to provision on the Ametnes cloud. So what I'll do is I'm going to open up my editor. VS Code is my editor of choice. So we'll pop over here. And what I have the GitHub repository open here. And what I'd like to do is go ahead and start provisioning a Ametnes Cloud instance. So what we have here is we just have some of the basic Terraform boilerplate. And we'll go through some of this in a bit more detail here in a second. But down here, we have our actual resource for our HarperDB service. So what we can do is I already have one provisioned. And what I'd like to do is set up a second one that we can do our test on with today. So what I'll do is I will copy this resource here, and then I'll paste it down below. And then we'll just change this over to instance number 2, just to make this quick and easy. And you can see some of the different capacity configurations that we have here as well. And then some of our configuration. And then one thing that I'll do is I'm going to add this in here just so that we can get the connections all together and they're all in the same place essentially. And what this will do is this will actually allow us to launch a second instance. So one thing that I've already done is I've already initialized Terraform on my local machine, but usually you would have to run Terraform init just to get some of the dependencies in the right state. But one thing that we can do is we can go ahead and run Terraform apply. And whoops, we actually need to be in the folder. Try that again. And this will take a look at our current state, see what we have, and it'll see that we already have our location created. We already have an existing instance created. So it'll see that in our state and check Ametnes Cloud, make sure that those resources are actually still there because they could have already got deleted in another way, possibly. So while this is running through here and it's refreshing our state and getting up to date, Michael, I did have one question for you regarding this. I noticed this was released recently. Are there any other kind of cool tools or utilities like this that Ametnes has coming out soon?
Yeah, so we are working on a few too. So one that is perhaps worth mentioning is the fact that if you think about the landscape that data services for any organization, you'll have multiple data services. We are looking to incorporate, artificial intelligence in understanding of, weaving through your data sets. You could have databases, NoSql databases, traditional SQL databases, or caching or messaging tools within your Ametnes Cloud environment. So what we are looking to do is to incorporate the artificial intelligence to be able to gather insights out of this data, since they're all sat on the same platform. It's a piece of tool. Obviously, with the recent development in AI with ChatGPT, we're looking to leverage that and see what we can do to make Ametnes, obviously, Ametnes users and customers get the benefit of artificial intelligence. So just stay on the lookout for that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that sounds really interesting. And yeah, there's definitely been a big uptick in artificial intelligence stuff lately. And even on my personal blog, I've done an artificial intelligence article lately, which I normally don't do because it's just become such a big thing. But so back to Terraform real quick. So it's already taken a look at what we have in our state, and it's already basically telling us what it's going to add and what it will change. So I'll go ahead and tell it yes, just so it can get started, because it will take about 3 or 4 minutes for the instance to get provisioned completely, and for HarperDB to install and get up and running. So now that we have that out of the way, I can go ahead and show some more of the actual details behind the Terraform provider. So in the main.tf file, that's where all of the meat and potatoes kind of are, really. So up here, we're going to kind of declare our provider and establish some of our data sources, for example, like our Ametnes project and our Ametnes location. Then what we're going to do is we're actually going to set up a Ametnes network to use. And this is useful because that way we can set up the networks that we need and tear them down as we don't need them. And we don't have to leave them running and configured in our cluster, for example. The next thing, which we already covered, was the HarperDB resource and service itself. So in here, we can do some of the basic configuration, like giving it a name, setting its description, and then the kind, and that's the actual service that we're going to be launching. So this could be any of the other services that Ametnes has. I think Michael could actually give us a few examples, but like Grafana, I know is one of them, but what are some of the other services that are available right now?
Yeah, we do provide a Neo4j, for example. We're working on Airflow, and that's in the pipeline. We're also working with TID Engine as well. So there's a bunch of others. MySQL, Postgres, those are the traditional ones that we all know. But there are a bunch of others that are in the pipeline. But essentially, right now, what I listed earlier, Grafana is a good one. Loki is another one for logging database. So we've got a bunch of other time series databases as well. So, yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's good to see. So if we keep going down the configuration, we then get to our capacity configuration. And here's where we can configure like how much storage, how much memory and gigabytes our system has. So that's all good to see. And then we get down to the configuration. And what I have set up here is it's just getting all of these informations from our variable file. And what I have here is we have our secrets TF vars file. And in here, we have all of our very sensitive details, right? We have our Ametnes email, our Ametnes token, and then we have some details about our project specifically. For example, my project is just called default in Ametnes Cloud that I'm using. And then we just have some location information for where we're going to actually deploy these resources. And then we just have our credentials, so like our admin username and password and our cluster admin username and password. And my password's not ABC123 today, so don't feel too worried about that. And other than that, the only other file we have in here is our variables.tf file. And really, this is just all of the other configuration that we have, like, for example, the API URL for Ametnes. For example, if you were using like a test environment, or something like that. So this all looks good. And while this service is still spinning up, because we also have to wait for HarperDB to install as well. In the inside of the main TF file, that's all there really is to actually allocating the services, which I thought was really awesome. But with some providers, it can sometimes feel like kind of configuration fatigue. There's so many different things that you have to set up just to spin up one little container, right? So it's really awesome to see how straightforward it is with the Ametnes, and it's definitely something that I appreciate as a developer myself. So the next thing that we can kind of go over with this is that the great thing about Terraform is that we're going to show off some GitHub actions later, and you could implement this as part of your CI/CD. For example, if you wanted to actually spin up a HarperDB instance, you could then deploy your custom functions to it and then do an actual real integration test with HarperDB and test it like that. And that's one of the really cool things I love about infrastructure as code is it kind of allows us to do that and, automate certain actions within our environment, which is always useful because, the more time we can kind of spend on coding, the better, and the less time we have to like have the DevOps headache basically is always nice. So that looks great. So Michael, I did have one other kind of question for you. So we talked about some of the, future services and all of those different actions. But, as a developer, if I wanted to use Ametnes, do you have any other cool resources for developers already ready to go, like some different projects that we could try out, or what kind of resources do you have for developers, like example projects to deploy an Ametnes instance, for example?
Yes, that's a great question. So we are working on more and more examples, example projects, and in that particular repository that this project is in, we intend to put in a lot more examples. So currently, we've got an example of how to use the Terraform provider. We are working on examples. For example, we did a lot of work on stress testing HarperDB. So we'll, at some point, future date, we'll touch base with HarperDB to see if they are comfortable us publishing this, that information. But essentially, we intend to work with database vendors or other data services vendors to make sure that anything that we find, for example, you and I had talked offline before about this GitHub action. So it's something that once we've tidied that up, it might be really cool so that people don't have to, any users of HarperDB don't really have to string things up. It's easy to incorporate this into the CI/CD pipeline. So that's our intention, to actually put a lot more of this, to publish a lot more of this work as open source on GitHub. Okay,
awesome. Yeah, because definitely there's so many pain points we have as developers. So that's good to hear. So back in the project, it's finished deploying the instance, and we can see all of the different, we can see both of the instances we have here. We have, of course, the regular HarperDB endpoint, then our custom functions port, and then the clustering port. And if we take a look, I'm pretty sure, let's see. So this one here will be our newest one that we just created here. So let's go ahead and copy this resource. And what we'll do is we'll hop over to HarperDB Studio and actually set this up. So let's see. We'll come back here. And then we've got a HarperDB Studio here. And what I'll do is I'll go back to my instances and we'll create a new instance here. And I'm going to register a user installed instance and then drop this port in here, or the host resource URL here. And then let me grab the port real quick. Good. All right, there we go. And we'll just name this one Ametnes 2. And then we can add in our credentials here. So let me paste in my super secret password here, and then we can click next. And I'll just set it up as a default instance. And I'll agree to the terms of service, and then we'll go ahead and add the instance there. All right, cool. So now that we have this instance added to HarperDB Studio, we can really get moving with the demo and looking at some of the different custom functions that we have set up. Awesome. So before we get started with the custom functions, we're going to want to import some data first, just so that we have some data to kind of execute with our custom functions and to play with. So I'll come over here and I'll select the instance we just added. And what I'll do is I'll go ahead and add in the schema of movies. And I'm going to use the data set that we used in the last webinar, which is just a set of movies and directors. So I'm just going to add a schema for movies and then a table called movies. And then I'm going to add a secondary table called directors, and we can just add this one here. So since we're only going to be using the movies one, we can probably just proceed forward with this one. So let's go ahead and we can import some test data that I've prepared for this. So I will copy this over and we'll paste this in here and we'll go ahead and insert. All right, awesome. That looks good. So now that we have some of this data here, we can actually start writing some of our different custom functions. So if we head over to functions, we don't have any created quite yet, since this is a brand new instance. So how HarperDB breaks up the custom functions is they're all tied up into separate projects. So that way we could have different projects with different dependencies and routes, and we don't have to worry about breaking up the routes into different things. HarperDB will kind of handle all of that for us. And if you're new to custom functions completely, which even I was at some point, it's a really awesome way that we can add a standalone JavaScript API to our HarperDB instance, as Jackson covered earlier. And one thing he mentioned earlier is that since our data is so close to our API, we can really deliver it in a lightning fast fashion. We're not having to worry about it spending, hundreds of milliseconds to make a network request across the network or across a VPN. It's instant and we get it immediately. And what's also cool about custom functions is that we can host a static front end alongside our API. And that's awesome for me as a full stack developer, because we can host our database, our API, and our front end all in one simple fashion. So that means we can take our React front end and throw it in there with our custom functions and deliver things in one package, which I really like as a developer. And it really kind of shows the simplicity of HarperDB as well. Because I know I've spent countless hours myself, composing a similar setup with a database, an API, and then a front end. And just for it to all kind of be handled for us is pretty amazing to me. So as I mentioned, it's a standalone API. So one thing that you'll notice is that earlier when we were looking at the output is that there's a different port that the custom functions runs on. So if we actually copy this, let's see, move this Zoom window down, and we open up a new one, we can see that this is actually using 9926. We go ahead and connect to this real quick. Oops, we'll actually need HTTP. Oops, there we go. And let's see, I should connect in a second. So if we come back to HarperDB, one thing that we'll need to do is actually grab the port from the Terraform. So let me open this back up real quick, and right here where we have our functions, we can see it's actually running on 256. There we go. So let's copy this over real quick. And this window. There we go. Awesome. There we go. Cool. So it's a 404, but that's actually a good response for us because that's actually showing that it's working. So back in HarperDB Studio, let's go ahead and set up our initial project. So we can name this whatever we'd like, but for example, I'll name mine sample. And what this will do is this will actually deploy a boilerplate project that HarperDB prepares for us. That's got an example route, an example helper, and an example static front end that we could use as well. So now that we have this created, we can actually see a lot more detail here. Over on the left-hand side, if we take a look at this, we can first see all of the different routes that are set up for this custom functions project. So by default, there's only one route and there's a bunch of data in here. Then we have our helpers, and these are basically ways that we can set up repeated functions without having to copy a bunch of our code to different routes, for example. Then down below here, we have a shortcut to our static output. And then we have, as we saw earlier, some of our data, for example, where our custom functions are housed on the machine, and then the server URL as well. So if we come back up top, let's take a look at what we have here in the routes. So they give us a pretty good example here. For example, we're importing a helper up here, and then there's a server route for the base URL that's just for the get method, and it's just returning some basic information from the SQL database. So what we can do is we can get rid of a lot of this different boilerplate to actually make our route. So we can get rid of all of this, and we can delete this here. Looks good. And while we don't have a dev.dog schema, we can go ahead and modify this to actually be the correct schema and table. There we go. So like this, we could have all of our different movies exported on like a /movies endpoint if we would like. So since this is working as is, we can go ahead and save this and actually test this route out. So let's go ahead, and we've got the save button down at the bottom here. And let's just double check, that looks good. Cool. All right, so let's go ahead and save this. And as I mentioned, we have our project, and that's actually how HarperDB breaks up our different projects on the API. And that's where the API actually knows where to send our request in the long run. So if we come back to this tab earlier, we can add /sample on the end, since that was our project name that we created here. And since this is just using the root URL, we don't have to worry about adding anything on the end. And it's also a GET request, so we can do this in our browser. So if we go ahead and click enter, you can see we're actually getting an unknown column name. Because I actually messed up the query here, this actually needs to be title instead of name. So pretty cool. Go ahead and save this. And then after we give it a few seconds, because it also has to restart the custom function server, we can then submit the request again. And we got to wait for it to restart. But let's see, I think I can get it going. But so let's just give that a second. But really, this shows how we can create kind of a custom route for that. So that's pretty awesome. One other thing we could do is we could import a different helper to execute some of the functions on here. So for example, this helper that they have, for example, we can add a new one here. Like my browser is not, let me refresh. Browser is not playing nice with me for some reason. Let's see. Of course, it's the demo effect. I'm doing a demo and it doesn't want to play along anymore. So let's go ahead. I'll add a new helper called filter, and we can click the add button here. And then once this creates it, it will basically allow us to import this into the different routes we would like, and we can kind of do any of the real actions we would like to do. So for example, it gives us actually a filtering example that's kind of funny by default, but we can delete some of this and kind of modify it exactly how we would like. So if we, for example, wanted to actually get rid of certain values from being returned, we could pass this a list of movies, for example. And inside of the movies, we could basically have this return a filter. So if we use the filter parameter, we can basically exclude some results that get returned. So what this will do is this will give us we'll say this will be a list of movies, and let's make a list of movie titles we maybe don't want to actually return. So we can say, for example, like if there were some test movies we had, we can add an array of test names, and we can say like test movie 1 was one of our test movies that maybe somehow snuck into our data set and we didn't want it to be in the final response. So from here, what we could do is we could basically check if the movie title was within that array. So to do this, what we can do is we can call test names, and then we can use the includes method, and then we can check the movie title. But we'll actually want to negate this, since includes would tell us if it's in there, and it would actually be the opposite of what we want. It would include all the movies only if they're in this list. So this looks good. And one other thing that we can do is if you have the module type set up in your package.json, you can use ES6 and things like that. But what we'll do is we'll change this to module.exports. And then this way we can just export a single function from here. And this should work fine. So we can go ahead and click save there. And then back in our route, we could import this, for example, if we wanted to. And use this to actually filter out results as they're returned from the database. Or if we just had some static stuff we wanted to return, we'd be able to do it in a repeatable fashion. So let's go ahead and refresh one more time, because the browser is fighting me on this demo. There we go. So in here, we can then import the helper from here and use it in our different functions. One thing that we can do, for example, this is a very straightforward and it's just returning a database call. But if we wanted to, for example, modify some of this data, one thing that we can do is you can turn this into an asynchronous handler, and then we can assign this to a variable, and we'll have to await this, of course, since this will be a promise because it's not an instantaneous. HarperDB is quick, but not that quick. We still have to use a promise. So then in here, this response would actually be a list of all of the movies. So with this list, we could then modify it as we want. Or one thing we could do is we could then return our filter on this response, basically. So let's go ahead and import this here. And we could basically import it like so. So then we've got our helper imported. We're assigning our response to this variable. Then we're just going to return whatever the return response is from our filter function, and that will then JSON encoded out to our users. So that's a really quick way that we can kind of modify it in HarperDB Studio. But personally, this is great. And we've got the Monaco editor, which I really like. It's always a big help for me because it's, very feature rich and it's got a lot of, really great features in it. But I like to really code locally, which is something that Jackson mentioned earlier. So one thing that I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'll open up a Visual Studio Code instance I have here. Let's see, this one. And what I have here is I'm using VS Code and a remote SSH session to a server running HarperDB. And this is basically a way that I can quickly prototype different routes and code and even use libraries if I wanted to as well. So if you wanted to set this up inside HarperDB Studio, it actually tells you where your custom functions are housed. And inside of the custom functions directory is just a folder for each of your projects. So what I've done here is I've just told VS Code to open the API project that I have on this instance. So what's really great about using it locally is, number one, it's instantaneous. We don't have to deal with, our browser fighting us like it might have been fighting me earlier, and we also get extensions, which I think is probably the biggest help. So my personal favorite extension to use when I'm working with custom functions is ESLint. And that's because it'll catch a lot of our mistakes as we're coding. And we don't have to wait until we save the file and then we make a request and then it fails. It's a much quicker way to prototype your routes, basically. And you can kind of know whenever mistakes happen. So for example, if I made a mistake here and it was not HDB core, it was hub core I might have written, using ESLint, we can instantly catch those kind of mistakes. And I'll know right away, like, oh, that's not even defined. This actually needs to be HDB core. So that's really kind of the cool thing about extensions. ESLint is just one of the many that kind of helps you keep a consistent code style and, nothing additional in your code. And there's a lot of other great ones, like, for example, trailing spaces, or even if you make like spelling mistakes, it can catch different mistakes like that if you use extensions. So that is kind of how we can go through it. And we still get all of the same functionality that we do in HarperDB Studio, plus more, since we can also edit our static files in here as well. And of course, we can edit our helpers and everything that we basically need from here. So awesome. So one other thing that we can cover is actually debugging. So as I mentioned earlier, we can try and, do everything perfectly the first time, but that's not always going to be the case. We will make mistakes, or it could even be the case that we're developing a route for the first time. We're not quite sure how this response will return, or we're not quite sure what the data is actually set to at this point in the state. So it would be great to be able to debug things. So luckily for us, HarperDB has a lot of great debugging features built in. For example, the logger. And now, Jackson, I mentioned the other day we were talking, and you said there's some new changes that are coming to HarperDB for debugging. I don't want to put you on the spot, but can you share any of those new changes with us, and kind of get us excited?
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to allow you to effectively use your debugging tools from within your studio as they run. Sorry, not within the studio, but within your local IDE. So your traditional step through features, all of that's going to be made available. It's a release coming later this year is all I will promise.
Yeah, all right. That's probably a safe bet. So that sounds awesome, because really being able to kind of debug as we go will speed everything up quite a bit. So that is definitely great to hear. So how we can actually set different debugging up is, if you notice here, we have our logger exposed to us here. Now, HarperDB contains a lot of different log levels by default. I was looking through the documentation, and they do recommend you use logger.notify, since typically that one will always be it will always show up in your logs no matter what log level you have defined for the service. So it's really straightforward. It's much like using console.log, except we're just using logger.notify. And then in here, we can just send it a string. Also, another thing we could do is, if we had an object that we weren't quite sure what the value was, we could always just use json.stringify and then stringify that object into a string. And then this would then show up in our actual HarperDB status logs. So there's a couple different ways you can access your log. So much like the custom functions, there's a log folder within the HDB folder on the actual instances. You can also go to status up top here, and then you can see all of your different logs from here. For example, like this one's logging which operations are coming through and things like that. So let's go back to functions real quick, and we could add one, for example, and trigger it if we wanted to. So I always like to use notify just because, as they mentioned in the documentation, it'll always be picked up. So it's always good to see. So that is kind of debugging. I know I'm really excited to kind of see the new changes that are coming for debugging because, that is always, much like unit testing, one of the necessary evils in it. So speaking of unit testing, we can actually hop over to the unit testing portion because there's a little bit to that. So one of the, big problems we faced with, of course, custom functions is, we have to deploy this on a HarperDB instance and things like that. But there's a lot of testing and unit testing that we can add locally to catch some of these mistakes, much like we're using ESLint locally to catch a lot of these mistakes before they make it into the code base. And we could set up, for example, a GitHub action to test code on every single push request or pull request. So that way we know, oh, they just introduced a breaking change to this feature, for example. So one thing I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'll open up my the code repository for the webinar once again. And we'll go ahead and minimize this down. We won't quite need that anymore. And we can close out of these files. So if we take a look at unit testing custom functions, in here, I have a very straightforward custom functions project. It's basically just running the diff command that's built into Redash. And we're going to unit test this. And basically, it's very straightforward. There's one helper and one route. And basically, users will send a post request to the root URL for this project. And it will then calculate whatever the difference is between two different lists. So you could send it ABC and AB, and it will tell you that C is missing, for example. Then inside of here, what I'm doing, just to show off how we can unit test the HDB core method, is I'm just basically pulling a sample value out of the database. So this is just kind of a straightforward example, where we're just using the SQL operator to submit a SQL request to HarperDB and grabbing a fictitious ID, basically. Then all we're doing is we are returning the difference in those two arrays and then that value that we fetched from the database. So pretty straightforward, but testing it is pretty unique. So one of the first things that we will need is kind of a boilerplate Fastify app that we can actually use to focus the testing off of. And as you can see, it's very straightforward. It's just a very basic Fastify app. We have the option to add, different parameters to it if we need, but really this will get you going with HarperDB because there's not really a lot that you need from the Fastify side, basically. All right, so with that being said, inside of the testing folder, inside of the unit testing custom functions folder in the repository, we have all of the different tests that I've created. So if we take a look at the helper one, for example, all we're really doing is we're importing that helper from where we have it in the custom functions folder. And then we just have a very straightforward tap test, which is just making sure that it actually calculates the difference. So I'm using strict same to basically check and make sure that if we run A and B and A, it tells us that the difference is B is missing from the second array, basically. And this just makes sure that the library is working as intended. In kind of a real world example, this would be a much more involved unit test, and this would probably be a much more involved helper than just unit testing. This is returning the right response because I'm sure the Redash developers did a great job testing this themselves, but just to kind of show how that goes. Whenever we get to the route, this is really where a lot more of the detail kind of comes in. So one of the things that we'll need is we need a way to create a stub. And that way, if we have to make a request to HarperDB, we need a way to basically tell it, oh, I actually only want this to return a certain value. Because in the unit test, we don't really have HarperDB running locally. We could, and that could be an option as well, as you could run it locally and then upload this custom function to it and then do an integration test that way. But this way, you don't have to keep it running. You can just do it all locally on your machine. So the first thing that it will do is it will go ahead and import all the libraries that we need. And then, for example, it'll import the boilerplate app we have, and then the logger that I'm using as well, which basically just emulates the HarperDB logger with all the different levels like trace and debug and info and so forth. So once we have the app created, then basically I create the callback for the HarperDB database call. And basically I'm just telling it to return the customer ID with a random UUID that I'm generating beforehand. Then whenever we actually get to register the route, because by default, we have to register the route with the app so that it knows the route's there and it can handle it properly. So what I'm doing is I'm registering the route, and then all we're going to do is just import our actual route from the custom function. So all I'm doing is just importing this route file here into it. Then the second parameter we can pass, for example, the logger and the HDB core object. And that way, all of our custom functions have access to these objects. And this is also how we are able to trick the response and tell it exactly what to return when we would like it to, basically. All right. Then the next thing it's going to do is actually submit the request. So here we're sending a post request to the root URL with a predefined body. And this is basically just us testing the way that the response actually works. And for example, I have the first test case here, just checking that the status code is 200, just making sure that we didn't get a 400 or anything like that, for example. Then the next thing it's going to do is actually check the response body. So one thing that I'm doing here is I'm parsing the response body as JSON. And then the second value here is actually what value I'm expecting this response to be. And this way we can kind of assert and tell it basically exactly what we're expecting return value to be. And for example, I'm telling it the value from DB is going to be equal to that ID that we generated earlier, that we then return through this sign-on.js stub. And then down here, we're just basically checking to make sure that it calculated the diff correctly between these two arrays, basically saying that B is missing from this one. All right, so that was a lot of talking, but unit testing, always a fun subject and always interesting. So what's great about this is that, let me go out to the right folder and we'll go to unit testing and then the testing folder. And we could run yarn test, for example, and this will actually run all of the test cases we have configured. So right now I only have 3. I have that helper, I have a unit test for the logger, and then I have a unit test for that route that we have currently. So as we can see there, they all passed and returned correctly, but we could always edit them and kind of tweak them exactly how we need and make sure that we're getting good code coverage as well, because TAP has that ability built in as well to give you a code coverage map, which is awesome to see. All right, cool. So with this said, one cool thing I wanted to show was a quick GitHub action that actually shows testing this. So I'm going to show the GitHub action in a bit more detail on the next step, but basically using the GitHub actions, once we have the code checked out and we have our Node.js library installed, we can then install any dependencies that we need and then just run our test command, which will run tap and run our test suites for us, basically, in our CI/CD pipeline, for example. I like to set these kind of things up on, for example, you can see I'm doing it on push request as well as pull request. And that's because if a developer is submitting a pull request, we can instantly test the code that he's submitting and just make sure that it's proper, it's up to date, and that it's passing all of our tests, basically. Awesome. So that was unit testing kind of in a nutshell, pretty quick, but it's pretty awesome. I was pretty happy to figure that all out myself. It was pretty fun to kind of read through the Fastify docs and play with that and kind of see how we can set up the stubs and mocks and all of that. Awesome. So with that said, now we've got our custom functions developed. We've debugged our custom functions. We've unit tested our custom functions. The last thing we actually need to do is now deploy these custom functions. So we've got a few options when it comes to this. A great option that we have, I'll pull up HarperDB Studio real quick, is inside of our custom functions here, we can actually deploy it straight from HarperDB Studio. So we could click here, and I have a test instance set up that we were using earlier for the local coding. And here you can see it has custom functions enabled, but it doesn't have this project. So I could actually click deploy here and deploy it to that remote instance. So pretty awesome. And then once it's on there, we could always remove it if we want, and we can deploy it this way. So I think that's super awesome that we can do it that way. However, that's not just the limit here. Since this functionality is exposed via the HarperDB API, we can also write scripts to do this for us. In many of the HarperDB projects I've created, they actually come with a script to do this exact thing. But what I thought was really interesting was for us to do this in a CI/CD pipeline. For example, if we had a production instance that we always deployed our custom functions to, we could set up a CI/CD pipeline to deploy our latest version of our functions to this instance, or if we had like a test instance, for example. So what I'll do is I'll open up the GitHub repository one more time. And I'll go ahead and minimize this here. And we have one last folder, which is actually deploying the custom functions. So if we take a look at the GitHub action here, let me minimize this. This is very similar to the one that we're using for unit testing, except we're using a custom action that I created to deploy this. So basically, we're going to do very much of the same thing. We're going to check our code out, install our dependencies. Then when it comes time to deploy the custom function, we're going to use this custom action. Inside of this action, we really just need to pass a few things, like, for example, the admin credentials, where you actually want to deploy this to, the project name that you want to deploy it to, where your custom functions are housed, for example. And then if you want to worry about unauthorized certs and self-signed certs and all that fun stuff. So we could use this to then submit the, not submit, but deploy the custom functions project to our instances of choice, basically. So I've actually set this up in the GitHub repository that we're using. So let me open up my browser again. And if we come back over here and we go to actions, and I'll click this here. And what I've done is I've combined the unit testing and the deployment GitHub action into one. So we can see here, first thing it's going to do is set up Node.js like we saw. It's going to install all of the dependencies. Then it's going to unit test our custom functions for us. And that way, if any of this fails, it will actually stop the deployment from happening. So luckily, all of our test cases passed, so I'm good to go. Then the next thing it's going to do is actually deploy our custom function and use that custom action that I created. So here you can see it found a total of 49 files. So that's all of your helpers, your routes, any of your dependencies, and your static files, for example. So it will take all of those and package them up and then deploy it out to your instance of choosing. And we can see here, deployment's finished, successfully deployed project. And then it's actually marked as a sensitive secret. So it's not going to show us what the project name was here, but it was test. So I'll break the secret for y'all. It wasn't very secretive, and ultimately it depends how exposed your setup is. So awesome. That's how we can deploy it and use a CI/CD pipeline or GitHub Actions to do some of these actions. So I've got one last thing with custom functions that I would like to cover, and it's something that Jackson had mentioned earlier, which were the project templates. So HarperDB has released numerous of these templates, and there's also many from the community themselves, because I know I've even contributed probably a handful myself. So there's quite a few out there. And what's great about these is that they kind of shortcut our development. So I'll hop over to the HarperDB add-ons GitHub account. And here we can see a lot of the different templates they have available. One of my favorites is the API cache one. And this one you can actually set up and cache all of different API responses for your different users. So what's great about these templates is that they do a lot of the different things that we may already want to do. So we can take them, modify them, and tweak them exactly how we need to fit our exact use case. And it'll save us hours of development time, basically. So for example, the API cache one I mentioned, you can send it a API URL. It will take the response, cache it in the database, and then give you the response. And what's great is that instead of a API response taking 2 seconds, it'll take milliseconds, basically, because all it needs to do is just read it from the HarperDB database and return it to you. It no longer needs to make an external request, basically. So that was one of my favorite projects and templates that I wanted to mention was the caching one. But as you can see here, there's all different kinds that are available. Like here's the API caching one. I know there's some other ones in here, for example, like for OAuth and different functions like that. And I've even made a few for like cryptocurrency stuff, or I've even made some for Kafka for actually like ingesting data with HarperDB. So there's all different types of templates that are available out there. And the caching is like the very big one I wanted to mention there. So that's it for the demo and a lot of the information about custom functions that I wanted to go over today. What I'd like to do is I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to our guest for some different questions and some kind of get more information about them where we can find out more information about HarperDB. So Jackson, I'll throw you in first again. So where can I go as a developer to learn more about HarperDB?
Well, our website, harperdb.io, is always a great place to start. We have all of our docs there, and there's a button in the upper right-hand corner that will lead you to the studio that you were just in, and that allows you to spin up a free instance. You can either install that locally, or you can run it on our hardware as a free instance, so you can play around with almost no overhead, be up and running in half a second.
Awesome. All right, and Michael, same to you. Where can I go to learn more about Ametnes Cloud?
So to actually learn more about Ametnes Cloud, it's best to visit our YouTube channel. There are a bunch of videos out there that talk about setting up a Kubernetes cluster and turning it into an Ametnes Cloud data service location, and then deploying the agent and starting to provision resources. So we're going to record a video with just showcasing how to use the Terraform provider, which we only just released yesterday. And then also we have obviously a lot of information on our website. We are polishing up our documentation to update it, because in the last 3 months we've done a lot of updates that need to go on there. So, but at the same time, it's easy to try Ametnes Cloud. Just create an account. If you've got a private Kubernetes cluster, deploy the agent and start to provision resources. So we essentially aim to take that pain point away, as you touched on earlier. When you provision these resources within a cloud native environment, you have to worry about so much configuration, resource allocation, getting to know what the different Helm charts, different YAMLs apply to a Kubernetes environment. It's just a lot of stuff. So we take that pain point away and we take care of all that. So yeah, visit the YouTube channel. There's a lot on there, and the website as well.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, great. Yeah, and I know just in the last month that we've been kind of working together and working on these webinars, that there's been a lot of new things already. So I can only imagine what y'all been able to add in the last couple of months. So it's pretty awesome. So I've got one question here for Jackson related to HarperDB Studio. So one thing that you mentioned, there's a lot of new changes coming to HarperDB Studio, but do you think there will ever be a way to add a library from HarperDB Studio to my custom functions project directly?
Possibly. We're looking at it as sort of self-contained, in that you will have a package JSON, and you can obviously do npm install, include things in your project. However, in order to install that or edit that document, we have to do a little bit. We don't want to become a full-featured browser, right? We sort of meant for the studio to be just the overview of that project, and you can see basically what the code does. Generally, because we don't have GitHub integrated, and that would be very, very hard for a web browser to manage it without access to the file system. We'd have to route all of that management through HarperDB, which feels like a lot of extra stuff, especially when most people use VS Code or WebStorm to build their apps. So we have certainly considered it, and I can put that on the feedback board.
Yeah, for sure, and that definitely makes sense, because you really could do so many things, but it's like, really, should you? And managing it locally usually works better anyways. So yeah, definitely being able to handle it locally has always worked great for me. So
I will say that we recently added the ability to, when you are deploying a project, rather than wrapping up all the dependencies with that project and sending it over to the new server, you can actually choose to run npm install through HarperDB. And so effectively, you send the shell minus dependencies to that server, and then you run npm install locally. That, of course, requires that that instance has outbound access to the internet. But assuming that that's true, it's a very easy way to reduce the size of the packages and ensure compatibility with the platforms to which you might be deploying it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, true. That's awesome. Yeah, I think I saw that feature the other week actually, and I haven't used it yet, but that's cool to know because definitely depending on how many dependencies you have in there, you could be sending like a gigabyte or something to the other server. So it's definitely a lot more straightforward if we can just send the actual code itself versus the hundreds of dependencies that we may end up having. So.
Absolutely.
Okay, awesome. Well, we're actually a little over time, so apologies for that. But we wanted to get through some of the questions that we had down here. So just to kind of recap, we took a kind of a deep dive into custom functions with HarperDB and took a look at how we can code them in HarperDB Studio and locally. Then we looked at how we can actually debug and unit test these custom functions to keep them working and make sure they're working as we intend as well. And then we took a look at the end on how to actually deploy these projects to our different HarperDB instances if we wanted, using a GitHub action or even using HarperDB Studio like we showed as well. So thank you everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Jackson and Michael, for joining me. It's been great having you on here on this webinar for sure. So awesome. And what we have kind of coming up next is our next webinar on April 26th is we're kind of diving even more into more of the advanced functionality like clustering and deploying HarperDB on a global scale versus just a single instance like we've been doing so far. So if you've enjoyed today's webinar, you definitely don't want to miss the next one for sure. So thank you everybody for attending today. Thank you again, Michael and Jackson, for hosting with me today. And we hope to see you all again next time. So goodbye for now.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.